Today we are digging into one of the biggest political, religious showdowns in American history.
5 years after the B.H. Roberts fiasco, Utah has again elected a church leader, Reed Smoot, to the Senate. All eyes are on the U.S. Congress again. Would they seat him?
At the height of the controversy, senators were getting 1,000 letters a day.
Suddenly, plural marriage, church finances, and even temple ordinances, Casey, are going to be examined under the public microscope.
Could a believing Latter-day Saint actually serve in the federal government of the United States?
Reed Smoot was a monogamist. If they can expel me from the Senate of the United States, they can expel any man who claims to be a Mormon.
I would rather have seated beside me in this chamber a polygamist who doesn't polyg than a monogamist who doesn't monog.
Under Reed Smoot's photograph, it just says one word. It just says Mormon.
What if the law of God comes into conflict with the law of the United States? How do you answer that?
Is Congress judging Reed Smoot, or is it judging an entire religion?
Is one person going to be held responsible for everything that their church does?
Well, hello, Casey.
Hello, Scott. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you, and welcome everybody back to another episode of Church History Matters. Today, we are continuing our series on the church and politics. And in fact, today, Casey, I think is part 3 of our turn of the century trilogy. I'm not sure what to call this.
Yeah, that's not a bad name. It's a little vague, but let's keep workshopping it. Maybe I was thinking the Saints and the Senate trilogy, even though 2 of the people we talked about didn't have anything to do with the Senate. At any rate, what we're talking about today is the third part of the story, which I would title Return of the Smootai or something like that.
Return of We're trying to riff off those Star Wars references.
Yeah,
I don't think it's working.
Greatest trilogy of all time in my mind.
Yeah. This is the third part of a trilogy that began with Moses Thatcher and the Political Manifesto. Maybe we should call it the Political Manifesto Trilogy.
Now, that's not super snappy, but it is accurate. And that's mostly because what we're talking about revolves around the Political Manifesto. Part 1 of the story centered on an apostle named Moses Thatcher. And just to catch you up, Thatcher was heavily involved in Utah politics, but he's also a member of the Quorum of the 12. Yeah. And when Utah was getting close to gaining statehood, church leaders asked the Saints to end their local political party, the People's Party is what it was called, and join one of the national political parties, either Republican or Democrat. And the goal was to get the Saints to split down the middle, more or less, roughly 50% Republican and 50% Democrat. But that was a tall order since about 90% of the Saints leaned Democrat.
Yeah, which might shock a lot of people today. But that probably had to do something with the fact that the Republican Party was created in part to destroy the church's religious practice of polygamy, and that Republican Congresses had passed crushing legislation against the Saints for the past 30 years, and that they had been conducting anti-polygamy raids against the Saints, you know?
Yeah. And that's probably enough reason to get the Saints to have some strong feelings against the Republican Party. And so remember that in order to achieve this roughly 50-50 split needed for statehood, church leaders kind of had to, for lack of a better term, force feed the Republican Party to the Saints. And they got prominent church leaders like Joseph F. Smith and George Q. Cannon of the First Presidency and John Henry Smith of the 12 to join the Republican Party to signal to the Saints that it was okay and respectable to do so. And in some cases, they had bishops literally divide their wards down the middle, and one side were the Democrats and one side were the Republicans.
Wild times. And remember that Elder Moses Thatcher was a staunch and outspoken Democrat during this precarious time for Utah, which naturally creates some conflict with other church leaders. Like in a political speech, we mentioned that it was in Ogden. Thatcher, he may have implied that Jesus would have voted Democrat and Satan Republican, which are some remarks that really stirred things up. And we should note that later Thatcher said, I was misquoted. But then he goes on record saying, but Democrats do favor moral agency and Republicans don't. So,
yeah. And Thatcher also ran for office in 1895 without getting permission from the First Presidency of the 12, as did B.H. Roberts of the 70, who we'll talk about in just a second. But remember, this was a precarious time because they were right on the cusp of Utah becoming a state, and church leaders wanted to signal to Washington that they were not involved in Utah politics directly. Yeah. So this was kind of an embarrassment. In fact, that October General Conference, Joseph F. Smith of the First Presidency, who was frustrated with the political actions of Thatcher and Roberts, just flatly publicly announced that no church general officer should run for political office without the blessing of the First Presidency. And 1 month later, both Thatcher and Roberts lost the election, which they felt was influenced by that General Conference talk. And to add further, because Joseph F. Smith was a Republican, Moses Thatcher was a little miffed because he felt like Joseph F. Smith had inappropriately used General Conference to promote the Republican Party. Well, make a long story short, Utah does become a state in January 1896, and then 3 months later, church leaders published what they called the Political Manifesto, which essentially said that any general authority who wanted to run for political office should first consult with the First Presidency and the 12. And they asked all general authorities to sign it, and most of them did, but 2 of them did not.
Yeah, Moses Thatcher and B.H. Roberts. And because Thatcher refused to sign the Political Manifesto, he gets eventually removed from the quorum of the 12 apostles. And remember, there's a whole backstory with his health and medicating with opium and not being able to meet with the 12 very often and some other stuff that you have to go back to that episode to listen to. But the situation essentially boiled down to this. They were saying to him, Moses, because we church leaders feel that there is a conflict between you running for office and you being a general officer of the church, look, if you insist on running for office, no problem. We'll just need to drop you from your position as a general authority representative of the church, and then there'll be no conflict. And so that's what they did. And he does actually remain a faithful member the rest of his life, and he was politically active as well. In fact, we talked about how he was actually nominated for the U.S. Senate in 1899, but he also refused to be seated. And he made that somewhat prophetic statement when he said that he didn't think any polygamist would ever be allowed to serve in Congress.
And that leads to part 2 of the story, which features B.H. Roberts. So Roberts, who's also a Democrat like Thatcher, also had big issues with the Political Manifesto. But where Thatcher avoided meeting with the general authorities, and this is partially because he's having some major health issues, Roberts just withstands them head on. He just directly defies them.
Yeah, Roberts took on the entire general leadership of the church over the Political Manifesto. But to the credit of everyone involved, the leadership worked with him, and he does eventually soften his position and will ultimately sign the Political Manifesto. And it was actually not long after that B.H. Roberts was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives on behalf of Utah after, I might add, consulting with the First Presidency and the 12, as he had agreed to do.
Yeah, and this was a major national test because Roberts was a polygamist. He was married to 3 women before official Declaration 1 was issued, and he continued to live with them and support them after the Declaration was issued. And a lot of people in the country began to say that if Roberts was allowed to serve in Congress, it was essentially a tacit endorsement of plural marriage.
And Roberts put up a valiant fight to keep his seat in Congress. A guy named H.G. Wells, he said, quote, Mr. Roberts stood like a giant and defended himself and his church. I never heard a more eloquent or cogent speaker in all my travels, close quote. But Roberts was ultimately voted out. And we know that when he arrived in Washington, members of the House challenged his right to be seated before he could even take the oath of office. A special committee was formed to investigate the case for months, and really interesting things play out from there.
Yeah, this massive petition campaign also happens that reportedly collected more than 7 million signatures urging Congress to deny B.H. Roberts his seat. And this is Protestant organizations, women's groups, anti-polygamy activists urging that Roberts seating in the U.S. House would signal acceptance of plural marriage. And in January 1900, after extensive debate, the House voted overwhelmingly, 268 to 50, to declare Roberts not entitled to his seat and declared it vacant.
And what's so interesting about the B.H. Roberts case is that it raises this constitutional question that is still discussed today, right? And that is, the Constitution specifies only 3 qualifications for serving in the House. And just to review, if you're a little rusty on this, number 1, you need to be at least 25 years old. Number 2, you need to be a U.S. citizen for at least the last 7 years. And number 3, you need to live in the state that you're elected to represent. That's it. And B.H. Roberts meets all 3 qualifications, no problem. His defenders, in fact, argued this case, right? They argued that the House of Representatives had no authority to add new qualifications based on what they called morality tests or criminal conduct. That's not one of the 3, right? Mm-hmm. And his opponents then replied that the House had the constitutional authority to judge the qualifications of its members, and they could refuse to seat someone whose conduct made him unfit. Mm-hmm. But if you have this argument that he's unfit, but his unfitness doesn't have any problems with the 3 qualifications, then now we've got this deadlock that happens, and that's what led to all of this debate, right?
Yeah. And we should note that this particular constitutional debate was largely settled nearly 70 years later. So there's a case called Powell v. McCormack in 1969, where the United States Supreme Court held that Congress cannot exclude a duly elected member who satisfies the Constitution's listed qualifications. So under modern constitutional law, many scholars believe that Roberts likely would have to be seated first, although the House would then have considered his expulsion by a 2/3 vote if it believed that he warranted. So they would have had to seat him in Congress and then vote him out. It probably would have turned out exactly the same, to be honest with you. But it does seem like they violated the Constitution in just kicking him out before he could even assume his place as a member of Congress.
Yeah, so after Roberts's ouster, the view on the ground in 1900 looked like this. No active member of the church is going to be allowed to serve in Congress, right? We were unpopular, and the polygamy thing and all of that, which actually then leads to what we want to talk about in today's episode, which is the 3rd part of the trilogy, the seating of Senator Reed Smoot.
That is right. Yes, today we are digging into one of the biggest political, religious showdowns in American history, the Reed Smoot hearings. And honestly, it's hard to overstate how much was going on in the background here.
Yeah. Smoot doesn't just show up in Washington out of nowhere. Like, he arrives in the middle of a major transformation for the Latter-day Saints and the nation. Like, let's just review real quick. Number 1, like, the 1890 manifesto of the church had happened, right? A little over 10 years earlier, and it started the slow end of plural marriage. Utah has now entered into the Union in 1896, and now Latter-day Saints are increasingly stepping into national life. By the early 1900s, they're now starting to serve in local and state governments all over the West, and that's a big deal.
Yeah, but there's still a big question still out there, which was, could a believing Latter-day Saint actually serve in the federal government of the United States?
Exactly. It's the federal government that's the issue. And Elder Reed Smoot of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, by the way, decided to find out the answer to that question. So with the blessing of church leadership, he ran for the U.S. Senate in Utah and won.
Yeah.
Now, we should note that Latter-day Saints had served in the Senate and House before, right? There was a member named Frank J. Cannon, who'd been elected to the U.S. Senate in 1896, seated without much trouble. Another member was named W.H. King. He served in the House from 1896 to 1898. But neither of these men, this is important, neither of these men were apostles or general authorities or polygamists, right? And so that was no problem. But then comes the B.H. Roberts controversy in 1898, which had the whole nation twisted up in a wad. And then, since Congress had successfully denied one elected Mormon general authority from being seated, now the precedent was set, right? The question was, could others be denied as well? It's now 5 years later, 5 years after the B.H. Roberts fiasco, and Utah has again elected a church leader, an apostle, Reed Smoot, to the Senate. So now all eyes are on the U.S. Congress again. Would they seat him? So that question sets off another national uproar and an even more intense and grueling congressional investigation than occurred with B.H. Roberts. In fact, the Reed Smoot hearings that follow are going to put not just Reed Smoot, but the whole Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints under an intense national spotlight. Suddenly, plural marriage, church finances, and even temple ordinances, Casey, are going to be examined under the public microscope.
Yeah. And the scale of the hearings is really wild. They stretched across 4 years, and they produced a 3,500-page record with recorded testimony from 100 witnesses. At the height of the controversy, senators were getting 1,000 letters a day, and the petitions from U.S. citizens around the nation alone filled 11 feet of shelf space in the National Archives.
That's not just a controversy. That's like a historical avalanche. I mean, this is huge.
This is huge. And throughout these grilling hearings, as we'll see, church leaders were compelled to clarify official teachings and bring church life more into line with those teachings. And that's maybe the most consequential outcome of all of this. Also, in a way, the hearings accelerated the process that the 1890 manifesto had begun. I'm talking about the manifesto that ended plural marriage, not the political manifesto. And it kind of set the church in a new direction of self-definition.
But there's one aspect we should highlight too, is that the Reed Smoot case is fundamentally different from the B.H. Roberts case in one really crucial way, and that is that Reed Smoot was a monogamist. He was married to this good sister named Alpha May Eldridge in 1884. He also worked hard to get Joseph F. Smith, who was the president of the church at the time, his support before running. And Joseph F. Smith actually believed having Smoot in the Senate could actually help the church. Charles W. Nibley later actually recalled Joseph F. Smith pounding his fist and saying, "If I have ever had the inspiration of the Spirit of the Lord given to me forcefully and clearly, it has been on this one point concerning Reed Smoot. And that is that instead of his being retired, he should be continued in the United States Senate."
Yeah, that's a pretty strong endorsement.
Yeah, it is. And Reed Smoot, as we'll find out, is going to need it.
Yeah, so let's back up and try and get the whole picture of the opposition against Reed Smoot. It actually started in Utah almost immediately after Smoot had announced he was running for office. So on the 24th of November, 1902, the Salt Lake Ministerial Association met, and 15 ministers passed a resolution opposing Smoot's election.
Yeah, then Reverend J.L. Lilac accused Smoot of secretly being a polygamist and even claimed that the church kept, quote, "a secret record that is in exclusive custody and control of the first presidency and quorum of the 12 apostles." So there's his conspiracy theory.
Yeah, and Joseph F. Smith, the president of the church, hits back immediately saying, quote, "There is not one word of truth in the assertion that Reed Smoot is or has been a polygamist, or that he has married a plural wife either since or before Utah became a state."
Yeah, and Reed Smoot understood what they were trying to do. He understood the stakes they were trying to raise right away. Like, in fact, he wrote that if the ministers kept pushing it, it's going to become obvious that this isn't just a fight against him. Here's how Reed Smoot put it, quote, "The ministers will have to show their hand to get anywhere, and then the people of the United States will know and realize that it is not a fight against Reed Smoot, but that it is a fight against the authority of God on earth and against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If this gang wins in this fight, you can depend upon it that it will be only a stepping stone to disbar every Mormon from the halls of Congress. If they can expel me from the Senate of the United States, they can expel any man who claims to be a Mormon."
Yeah. So what Smoot is doing is he's framing this as a test case, not just for himself, but for any church member that wants to serve in the government.
Yeah, it's against the whole church, as he's saying, right? And that's exactly how it plays out. Within a year, for instance, over 3,100 petitions are in Washington asking for Smoot's removal. Newspapers across the country jump into the fray as well, like the New York Sun. Here's what they said. They declared, quote, "War on Senator Smoot." And they quoted a women's club leader who said, "We will fight Apostle Smoot and defeat him. It is remarkable how easy it is to touch public feeling on the subject. An Eastern audience today is like a bundle of combustible material, and the question of polygamy is like a lighted match." So she realizes how explosive this. We just gotta connect Reed Smoot with polygamy, and this is gonna
blow up on its own. Yeah. And the Pittsburgh Gazette. So this is another Eastern newspaper. Is no gentler. They run a story where the title is "Smoot's Toga is in danger." I guess, like hearkening back to the days of the Roman Senate and wearing togas. But the real claim they're trying to make is that the church was trying to gain political control so that it could bring polygamy back, that they'd never really given up on it.
So that's the fear-mongering of the press right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's talk about when the hearings actually begin. So by 1904, after his election, the Senate hearings get underway, and they end up examining nearly every major aspect of Latter-day Saint belief and practice. Like, here's how historian Harvard S. Heath summed up the hearings. He said this: "The prosecution focused on two issues: Smoot's alleged polygamy and his expected allegiance to the church and its ruling hierarchy, which, it was claimed, would make it impossible for him to execute his oath as a United States Senator. Though the proceedings focused on Senator-elect Smoot, it soon became apparent that it was the church that was on trial."
And Reed Smoot seems to realize this really early on. He wrote that Chairman Julius C. Burroughs, a non-Latter-day Saint, told him directly, "I was not on trial, but they were going to investigate the Mormon Church."
Yeah, so interesting, right? For 4 years, the church is on trial publicly.
Yeah.
And that's why they're going to call President Joseph F. Smith to the witness stand. He's actually the first witness that Congress calls to the stand. And for over 6 days, they grill the president of the church over church doctrine, church finances, church temple worship, all the church practices.
Yeah, including one really memorable exchange about scripture that let's just read this as it's recorded in the record. We'll trade back and forth. Okay. So.
Okay. So this is where a guy named Senator Hoare, Hoar, Senator Hoare says, "Now I will illustrate what I mean by the injunction of our scripture with what we call the New Testament."
Yeah. And Joseph F. Smith replies, "That which is our scripture also."
Mm-hmm. And then Hoare said, "Which is your scripture also?" And
Joseph F. Smith answered, "Yes, sir."
And then Hoare says, "Well, you will recall the verse that says a bishop must be sober and be the husband of one wife."
And Joseph F. Smith replied, "At least." He's not wrong, right?
He's not wrong.
Yeah,
at least one
ways
wife
to read that passage,
right?
So
man, that's one of those answers that says a lot with very few words.
Yeah. And Joseph F. Smith also defends the sincerity of the manifesto. He was quoted as saying, "It has been the continuous and conscientious practice and rule of the church ever since the manifesto." This is the manifesto linked to plural marriage, "to observe that manifesto with plural marriages."
Yeah, and so when plural marriage comes back into the spotlight, things get really interesting and kind of dicey for President Smith. The hearings are going to, they're going to grill him on his current practice. So Joseph F. Smith, he's still living with his, how many wives? 6 wives at this time. And he's had 11 children with them, Casey, since 1890. Mm-hmm. And they're going to try to pull all this out. So they ask him about that, and he tells them that he still supports his polygamous wives and their children because he believed that marriages that predated the manifesto were still legitimate. He just defends this.
Yeah, here's the quote he shares. He said, I simply took my chances, preferring to meet the consequences of the law rather than to abandon my children and their mothers. And I have cohabited with my wives, not in a manner that I thought would be offensive to my neighbors, but I have acknowledged them, I have visited them. They have borne me 11 children since 1890, and I have done it knowing the responsibility and knowing that I was amenable to the law.
Ooh. He just says it. He just admits that. And that testimony caused an explosion of backlash. I mean, other church leaders also admitted that they had continued to cohabit with their wives after the manifesto, and that just blows up.
Yeah, the national press has a field day with that. And President Smith is caricatured during the hearings as a criminal in a prison uniform. And even Reed Smoot admits that this damages their case. So Reed Smoot wrote, "The testimony of Joseph F. Smith has startled the nation." And he said that the press was using this to question the church's faithfulness to the United States government.
And let's just highlight the problem here, because the problem is that the manifesto had been ambiguous in a couple of ways. There's some gray area here. Like, it did not clearly address what those people were to do who were currently in polygamist marriages, right? Or how those men who had already been married polygamously under the church's law were now to care for their plural families going forward. All it did was say, we pledge to not enter or authorize any more plural marriages from this point forward, right? That's all it explicitly said. So now the question is, what about the marriages that currently exist? Wilford Woodruff had said to church leaders and the men in the church explicitly, quote, "I did not, could not, and would not promise you that you would desert your wives and children. This you cannot do in honor." Right? So he was clear with them, with the church leaders and the men of the church, that you can't leave your wives. But that was left ambiguous in terms of what he said to the government, right? He just said to them, we're not going to do any more plural marriages.
Yeah. At the same time, too, there were still a few illicit post-manifesto plural marriages, which sort of fuels the controversy, too. And the pressure from the Reed Smoot trials pushes Joseph F. Smith to eventually issue what's known as the Second Manifesto. And this is the wording from the Second Manifesto. Joseph F. Smith announced, quote, "I hereby announce that all such plural marriages are prohibited, and if any officer or member of the church shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression against the church and will be liable to be dealt with according to the rules and regulations thereof and excommunicated therefrom."
So now the manifesto has teeth, right? And by the way, this Second Manifesto is going to lead to the removal of Elders John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley from the quorum of the 12 apostles. That there had been some marriages that were being solemnized, especially in Mexico and Canada, and these two apostles were in on doing some of that, which is going to be part of why they're going to be removed.
Yeah, they're removed from the quorum of the 12. Matthias Cowley stays in the church. I believe John W. Taylor's excommunicated. So again, it kind of brings up plural marriage again and forces church leaders to draw a hard line when it comes to plural marriage, harder than Official Declaration 1 did, the original manifesto. But there's larger issues, because even though Smoot doesn't and hadn't ever practiced plural marriage, some of his opponents argued that just his membership in the church alone should keep him out of the Senate.
Yeah, guilty by association, right?
Yeah.
By 1905, the New York press, a newspaper in New York, was literally publishing pictures of senators and listing under their photo different scandals they were involved in. Some were accused of fraud. Some had been indicted. Others had faced financial scandals. But under Reed Smoot's photograph, it just says one word. It just says Mormon.
Yeah. I found this newspaper. Reed Smoot kept newspaper clippings of all these. This was in special collections at BYU. And yeah, it's like a 2-page spread in the newspaper with pictures of all the senators, and it's like bribery, indicted. And yeah, there's a picture of Reed Smoot, and the only thing it says under him was Mormon, as if just being a Latter-day Saint was reason enough that he should not be allowed to serve in the Senate. And that tells you how the controversy, shifted. Yeah. If you're Mormon, you don't belong here. It was no longer just about polygamy. Critics were asking whether any faithful Latter-day Saint could serve in the federal government. And during this trial, the senators took sides for or against Smoot. In fact, one of the more memorable outbursts during this trial was when Senator Fred Dubois of Idaho was attacking Reed Smoot, and another senator, this is Boyce Penrose of Pennsylvania, while addressing the subject of polygamy, glared at one of his colleagues who had a reputation for being unfaithful to his wife. And this is probably the epic quote from the Reed Smoot hearing. He jumps up and he says, "I would rather have seated besides me in this chamber a polygamist who doesn't polyg than a monogamist who doesn't monog."
That's one of the best lines. And now, at the same time, some of the people opposed to Reed Smoot tried to make it about more than just polygamy because they knew they couldn't quite get their hooks in him on that front because he was a monogamist. But they want to make it about church membership in general, as we've said. So opponents start to begin arguing that temple covenants would make a Latter-day Saint incapable of loyalty to the Constitution. Like, just, I know for church members today, it might seem so bizarre. Like, how would those two be connected? Here's how one newspaper put it, quote, "It is generally admitted in Utah that the priesthood and all the leading spirits of the Mormon Church are members of a secret oath-bound fraternity whose chief meeting place is in the temple at Salt Lake City. This massive stone edifice, sacred in the eyes of the followers of the prophet Joseph Smith, and it is the one building in Utah within which no Gentile may enter." Dun,
Okay,
dun, dun.
so
That sounds nefarious.
it sounds just like wrong. I mean, were they aware that there were other temples in Utah? There's 3 other temples during this time that Gentiles can't enter into. And
Well, I think they can't
anyway,
accept to get baptized.
you can tell. Yeah, you can tell they're using kind of like, sensational language to suggest
Fear
this.
mongering, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, the Salt Lake Tribune took this even further. They demanded that Smoot answer questions like, have you taken an oath to avenge the blood of Joseph Smith upon this nation? Have you taken the endowment in the temple of the Mormon Church or elsewhere? And have you taken the obligations which are given all who go through the endowment house? It's clear what they're driving at here.
Yeah, the implication is unmistakable, right? They're saying if you've received a temple endowment, then your loyalty to the United States is automatically suspect for some reason. Why would that be?
Yeah. Well, newspapers across the country naturally sensationalized the temple. We still see this a little bit today, but back then there were headlines like "Death Penalties in Mormon Oath" or "Dead Married to Living," often without explaining what temple ordinances actually involved.
Yeah, that's a great way to make it sound super weird. Dead married to living.
Yeah.
What the heck? California newspapers even printed photographs of temple clothing. And ceremonies across entire newspaper pages. Like, it's getting out of control.
Yeah, I got to admit, when I was going through the newspapers surrounding Smoot's hearing, that was a really shocking thing. Was like the front page of a San Francisco newspaper showed a member of the church in full temple dress and doing some of the signs and tokens that are in the temple. So that was sort of shocking to see on the page of a national newspaper. And again, there's some painful moments surrounding this. For instance, so one witness was a guy whose name was Walter W. Wolf, a former Latter-day Saint educator who actually had defended Smoot only 2 years earlier. He testifies before the committee, and he admitted that the temple endowment was, quote, a very impressive ceremony, but then claimed, quote, in the covenant, the seed of treason is planted.
The seed of treason is planted in the temple? Come on, Wolf. What is that, brother? I'm trying to think through the temple ceremony, and I can't see a place where the seed of treason is planted. So he was giving the press and the Congress what they wanted. It feels
that's a sound bite, right? That's gonna carry on. Now, when Reed Smoot himself is questioned about the temple, he tries to downplay the idea that there's anything dramatic about receiving his endowment.
Yeah, he downplays it a lot, actually. So he explains that he had received the endowment at age 18 because his father was about to travel to the Sandwich or the Hawaiian Islands and wanted him to receive the ordinance first. Here's how Smoot testified. He said, quote, "I, of course, was very pleased, indeed, to accept the invitation. And before going, my father asked me if I would go to the endowment house and take my endowments. I did not particularly care about it. He stated to me that it certainly would not hurt me if it did not do me any good, and that as my father, he would like very much to have me take the endowments before I crossed the water or went away from the United States." So talk about downplay. He's like, my dad said it won't hurt you even if it doesn't do you any good. Like, just do it. He's like, okay, I guess I'll do it. So
yeah, he's downplaying, but I mean, honestly, but behind all this, there's sort of a hovering question that is maybe the most difficult constitutional question Reed Smoot faced, which was just to summarize: what if the law of God comes into conflict with the law of the United States? How do you answer that question?
Yeah, because that was the trap, right? They're trying to say, like, when your loyalties conflict, which one will you go with, your covenants or the Constitution, right? And I liked his answer. He said this, quote, "If the revelation were given to me and I knew it was from God, that law of God would be more binding upon me possibly than a law of the land. And I would do what God told me if I were a Christian. And I would further state this, that if it conflicted with the law of my country in which I live, I would go to some other country where it would not conflict."
Yeah.
So
that's a
nuanced
nuanced answer, but his critics sort of seize on that too as further evidence that his religious commitments come before his political commitments.
Yeah. So you can see what they're doing, right? They're trying to say he is not a viable candidate for the Senate because he has conflict of interest with the church. He's made covenants that are too binding, that if the laws of the land and the covenants or revelations or some future revelation were to come that conflicted with that he would not be loyal to the United States of America. So you see what they're trying to do, right? This is the whole play, right?
Yeah.
Now, when the hearings wrap up in the spring of 1906, many newspapers celebrated what they saw as an expose of Mormonism. For instance, the Baltimore Herald proclaimed, quote, "Mormon Church flayed. Smoot report goes in."
Yeah, and the Salt Lake Tribune was even harsher. Here's what they write. They wrote, "Reed Smoot's ambition has brought more suffering to his people than the work of every opponent of the church in the land, the destructive force of which was never equaled by the ambition of any man in the history of the Republic." Wow, there's no shortage of hyperbole in that particular statement.
Imagine being Reed Smoot and like reading those headlines. And he did. And like you said, he collected these newspaper clippings and he started to wonder whether his own political ambitions had unintentionally hurt the church. He even writes an emotional letter to President Joseph F. Smith asking that the general authorities gather for fasting and prayer. He pleaded in that letter, quote, "If they think it is my ambition that has brought this trouble upon the church, I think they ought to have charity enough to ask God to forgive me." And then he added, "But I would like to impress upon them the fact that it is not me that is in danger, but the church." So he got where this was going, right? And finally, he asked church leaders to pray to, quote, "prevent another crusade against her people, to save the liberties of our people."
Yeah, and that's a remarkable letter because it shows how personally responsible Smoot felt for everything that was going on.
Yeah, he's not primarily worried about losing his Senate seat. He's worried about what the hearings were doing to the church.
Yeah. Now, fortunately for Smoot, he does have some influential defenders in the Senate. Not everybody was attacking him. Some people were defending him.
And one of the strongest of these was a guy named Senator Albert Hopkins of Illinois. Hopkins argued that everyone agreed on the basic facts. He said, here they are. Smoot meets every constitutional qualification. He has only one wife. He's never practiced polygamy. And so Hopkins asked this. He said, "Why then should he be dispelled from this body, disgraced and dishonored for life, a stigma placed upon his children, his own life wrecked, and the happiness of his wife destroyed. He then concluded simply, "He is a Christian, gentlemen, and his religious belief has taken him into the Mormon church." Okay?
Yeah. Yeah. And Senator Hopkins also argues about the dangerous precedent that this might set. So earlier in the hearings, he makes this statement: "Never before in the history of the government has the previous life or career of a senator been called into question to determine whether or not he should remain in the Senate. If members of any Christian church were to be charged with the crimes that have been committed in its name, where is the Christian gentleman who would be safe in his seat?" So is one person going to be held responsible for everything that their church does?
Yeah. A Christian who is a Protestant, would they be liable for the Crusades or whatever?
Is a Catholic responsible for the Spanish Inquisition, stuff like that?
Right. Yeah. So that's really the constitutional issue at the heart of the whole case, right? Is Congress judging Reed Smoot, or is it judging an entire religion? Are we creating a religious test for office?
Yeah.
No, we can't do that.
Yeah, that's the question kind of at the heart of the Reed Smoot hearing. So by 1907, the hearings had dragged on for nearly 3 years, and thousands of pages of testimony had been gathered, and dozens of witnesses have appeared, and newspapers had followed every twist and turn. And now everything comes down to one vote in the United States Senate.
Yeah. Smoot had already actually been serving as a senator during much of the hearings, which actually worked in his favor. His colleagues had gotten to know him personally, and even senators who disagreed with his religion often admitted that he had proven himself to be diligent and courteous and trustworthy. So that's going to help.
Yeah. So finally, after over 3 years of testimony, newspaper editorials, petitions, and political maneuvering, the day of reckoning arrives. It's February 20th, 1907, and the Senate met for final arguments before they vote on Reed Smoot's fate.
And around 4 o'clock that afternoon, the votes were counted. Smoot's opponents had failed to reach the required 2/3 majority needed to expel him. In the end, 39 Republicans and 3 Democrats voted to allow Reed Smoot to retain his Senate seat.
And I mean, if we're being honest, there's definitely political calculations behind that vote. But historians generally agree that one factor made an enormous difference. During the 3 years of hearings, Smoot had quietly earned the respect of a lot of his fellow senators.
Even Senator Julius Burroughs, who had been one of Smoot's principal opponents, he eventually admitted, quote, "The senator," meaning Reed Smoot, "stands before the Senate in personal character and bearing above criticism and above reproach." That kind of praise from an opponent carried some enormous weight, I would think.
Yeah, and Albert Hopkins, who is, again, a defender of Smoot, echoes the same statement. Here's what he said. He said, "Reed Smoot himself has never had but one wife. He is a model husband and father, an honest and upright citizen in every respect, and has made an honest, painstaking, and conscientious official as a representative from his state in the Senate of the United States."
Boom. So after everything the country had heard over those 3+ years, the debate ended not with accusations about Smoot's own conduct, but actually with widespread acknowledgement of his integrity and character, which is super cool.
Yeah, and in a few minutes, we need to talk about the aftermath of what happened to Smoot personally and his very successful political career after all this. But let's step back first and maybe consider the broader consequences of the Smoot hearings on the church directly and the kind of restructuring that it caused, which still impacts us today. So let's just go through them topic by topic. Scott, why don't you start us off?
Okay, yeah. So as a result of the Smoot hearings, marriage in the church, let's start with that topic, marriage. So you mentioned the Second Manifesto, which came out in April of 1904. Think about the context. That's when the Smoot hearings had started, right? And Joseph F. Smith had just been grilled about polygamy. So this comes out, right? Excommunication was now the consequence for new plural marriages. There was now teeth where the 1890 manifesto had none. And we should say, too, that the Smoot hearings actually trigger a canonical event. Literally, it's going to update our scriptural canon, right? Because it leads to the canonization of Wilford Woodruff's 1890 manifesto in the 1908 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. So now what had been an administrative policy and announcement of the church has been upgraded to Scripture, which makes it much harder to walk back. In terms of marriage, that's huge. One more I would add is the unintended result of this is that Mormon fundamentalism is going to be born from this. So, and what I mean is that every polygamous schismatic group that breaks off of the church dates its genealogy back to 1904, not 1890. Right. So anyone tracing genealogy of the FLDS Church or the Allred group or the LeBaron group or the Council of Friends, they're all tracing back to the Smoot hearings. This is the moment of fracture.
Yeah. And it's going to get worse and worse with those groups in the ensuing decades until the 1930s when the church kind of brings the hammer down. But this is a direct result of the Smoot hearings. Now, let's talk about a few political consequences too. So at the April 1906 conference, there was also a significant change in church leadership. So 3 apostles who are associated with post-manifesto plural marriages, they performed or they sanctioned plural marriages after the manifesto, and that's Mariner Merrill and John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley. They're replaced by George F. Richards, Orson F. Whitney, and David O. McKay. And I should specify one thing. Mariner Merrill died in 1905. So he's being replaced because he died, but there is significant evidence that he sanctioned some post-manifesto plural marriages. And it's actually a serious question of would he have been removed from the Quorum of the 12 if he was still alive when this happened. We mentioned earlier that John W. Taylor, who is the son of President John Taylor, is eventually excommunicated from the church. And you've seen his name pop up a little bit because he was associated with that revelation that John Taylor received that's been in the headlines for the last year or so. Matthias Cowley's priesthood is suspended, and he's later disfellowshipped. And their replacements, Whitney, McKay, and George F. Richards, kind of represent a new generation of church leadership that was fully committed to this post-manifesto standard of the church, especially David O. McKay, who's going to become one of the most important leaders of the 20th century altogether.
That's an interesting thread to trace back to the Smoot hearings, the David O. McKay presidency.
Which changes things. That's huge, right?
That changes things. Another kind of topic would be the prophetic office itself and kind of how we think about it. This is interesting. Under oath, Joseph F. Smith makes a really crucial distinction between revelation and inspiration. Like they're grilling him. This committee council member named Robert Taylor is grilling him. This is March 1904, and he's asking him about, have you received revelations for this church? And here's what he said. This surprised a lot of people. He said, President Smith, quote, I have never pretended to, nor do I profess to have received revelations. Whoa. I never said I had a revelation except so far as God has shown to me that so-called Mormonism is God's divine truth. Now, taken out of context, that sounds really damning. And so we need to contextualize this a little bit more. At issue here was the senator's fear that a religious body existed in the United States whose head, Joseph F. Smith, could without notice receive a divine communication that would overturn federal law and that Reed Smoot would be bound by it. Right? That's the case he's trying to make. So he asked President Smith point blank whether he had received any revelation submitted to the church in conference and adopted as binding. That's really what he's talking about. And so he answered flatly that he had not. Asked whether he could receive such revelations, President Smith affirmed that he could. He was sustained as prophet, seer, and revelator, but he insisted that he had not formally exercised that prerogative. But he did say this. He described receiving, quote, impressions of the Spirit constantly, while denying that those constituted revelation in this official institutional sense that the senator was trying to get at. In fact, Joseph F. Smith actually leaned into common consent, which traces all the way back to Doctrine and Covenants 26, right? But he elevates that from just maybe like a procedural nicety to almost like a constitutional constraint within the church, meaning that no doctrine or revelation would be binding upon church members without it being ratified by the church membership. He explains how that would work. And so he really leans into common consent. Basically, in other words, he's trying to convey to the Senate that he can't unilaterally compel church members to do anything just by claiming a revelation. We have a process in this church to ratify it, and church members get to decide what to do. He could not compel church members to do anything just by claiming revelation. And so that's what he's really getting at. He also said that he did not profess to be infallible, which was important to say that. Subsequent church leaders have said the same. Joseph Smith, for that matter, had said the same. But from time to time, that creeps back into the church, that the prophet's basically infallible. And here he said, I don't profess that. And it would take, again, church members voting to accept and to ratify revelation that I would receive. So I think that's important. He's clarifying something that church members care about a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that, he does receive a revelation that eventually becomes part of the Doctrine and Covenants. In 1918, he receives the vision of the redemption of the dead. So when I read this, I was like, oh, but he's not claiming that he has, but he does receive one that is accepted by the law of common consent and does become a major revelation in the church. I'd say, one of the most consequential revelations of the 20th century, to be honest with you. So that's an interesting thing. Now, let's mention another thing. We talked about the endowment kind of being presented. The endowment is actually placed in the federal record. Like, you can go and look up the text of the endowment from this time period because it is in the Reed Smoot hearings. And we've mentioned this before, especially in our series where we talked about the development of temple ordinances, but there was an oath of vengeance in the endowment, and you can look it up in there, but it did use the phrase, avenge the blood of the prophets upon this nation, which again, I guess could be considered incendiary. Now that particular part of the endowment stays in the endowment until 1927, when it's removed under President Heber J. Grant. But it's not hard to draw a line to say, hey, this came up in the Reed Smoot hearings, and it caused people to question whether we were loyal Americans. One person, like we mentioned earlier, even said that it planted the seed of treason. And so it was later removed under the endowment because it could be construed as being anti-government. And the net effect is that in some ways, the secrecy or the sacredness surrounding the temple ordinances loses some of its effect as this is going on. So that's another huge impact that happens. And I should mention that today in the church, we're pretty comfortable with the idea that the temple ordinances can change from time to time. Yeah, sure. Back then, that might have been a big deal. I'm guessing it was. Yeah, by the way, that phrase that you quoted, let me just add a little bit to it, because there was no implication that church members covenanted to avenge the blood of the prophets upon the nation. Like, the full phrase is that they would never cease to pray to Almighty God to avenge the blood of the prophets upon this nation. Now, I know it's like, okay, tomato, but no, it's asking God to take vengeance upon those who had killed the prophets, Joseph and Hiram. It wasn't covenanting that we will rise up against this nation and avenge Joseph and Hiram's blood. That's not what it was saying. But some people wanted it to sound that way. Now, I'm not trying to defend the phrase one way or the other, but I'm just saying in the Senate hearings, tweaking, what they were asking or what they were covenanting to do, they were just saying they would pray that God would avenge Joseph and Hiram. They were not saying they themselves, church members, would avenge Joseph and I think that's an important distinction. I'm glad it got taken out of the endowment, by the way, because that would be uncomfortable today to do that. But ultimately, that's what's at stake, and that's what's being scrutinized during this time. Yeah, good distinction. Thank you for making that clarification. Yeah, maybe another one we should highlight is kind of some of the policy and doctrinal reconstruction that happens as a result of this. Now that we lose polygamy, which had been pretty central. Imagine the last 50 years of the church at this time had been pretty rooted in polygamy, this eternal marriage network that was being created for eternity and the kingdoms that were being built through that. And
It was kind of the central deal. You couldn't just talk about the temple and marriage without thinking about plural marriage at this time. And so it's all just kind of embedded. So what is the church when you take polygamy out of it? That kind of left a vacuum to be filled in terms of us explaining ourselves and what is the central doctrine really, right? And the temple doesn't get reduced in importance, but we got to reconfigure how we talk about it. We got to reconfigure how we talk about marriage. And so that's all going to be recalculated, and the way we talk about it. It's actually, by the way, it's at the same time that church leaders start to emphasize more and more the first vision, priesthood restoration. I know Kathleen Flake makes a big argument. I don't know if I'm fully persuaded by her argument that in the vacuum left by plural marriage being taken out, now the first vision and priesthood restoration become our core narrative. I would argue that was already happening prior to this, but maybe this helped accelerate that, or maybe bring it into more of the spotlight. Like in 1905, Joseph F. Smith went to Sharon, Vermont, and erects a big obelisk in honor of Joseph Smith's birthplace. But 1905 was 100 years after Joseph had been born, so that probably would have happened either way. Again, but there's so that's happening. We also know that in the aftermath of the Reed Smoot hearings, Joseph F. Smith does a great job trying to define exactly what it is that church members believe. We're going to get several first presidency statements. We're going to get one on the origin of man, right? In light of all of the evolution controversies that were swirling at the time. We're going to get some in 1916 on the Father and the Son. In 1912, we're going to get the seminary program. We talked about in 1907, Joseph F. Smith is going to clarify the church's policy relative to Black Africans and priesthood ordination and temple admittance. And that's the first time we can actually point to that the church had a policy on that thing. So we see Joseph F. Smith trying to really pin down, after being grilled in the Senate on what do Latter-day Saints believe. It seems like in the aftermath of that, he is now systematically trying to pin down exactly what the policies of the church are, what we believe, what's core, what's not, in the subsequent decade or so after the hearings. And so, can you draw a straight line to the Reed Smoot hearings? I think on some of them, yes, on some of them, no. But I think it's all influenced by that. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, people don't appreciate how much Joseph F. Smith did to sort of, I guess, systematize the teachings of the church. He does so much to try and pin it down. And I don't think it's hard to say that the Reed Smoot hearings really made them realize that a lot of church teachings were a little loosey-goosey, to be honest with you. And maybe this was just Joseph F. Smith's personality. Maybe he would have done it anyway. But he issues all these theological declarations like the origin of man, which we have talked about a lot, that standardizes the theology of the church. And I agree with Kathleen Flake less here, but yeah, when I lead a church history tour and we start tracing, well, when was this monument erected or when was this site purchased? It's all Joseph F. Smith. Joseph F. Smith really starts setting up the church history sites that we know and love today. And that becomes a standard storytelling tool when we're explaining the history of the church. Now, I don't know if I buy the whole, and they shifted it towards this different part of the narrative, because it seems like it's still really important, and plural marriage still is a huge part of the church's story then and even today. But I mean, the overall message is that the Reed Smoot hearings do a lot to kind of shift the church towards assimilation. We have been our own thing, and now we're kind of moving more towards the mainstream of American culture, and national assimilation replaces separatism as the church's governing strategy. So everything after, things like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir being an American icon. I've heard more than one person say that, Mormonism is an American religion. It seems like a lot of that comes from us after the Reed Smoot hearing saying, yeah, we're Americans and we want to prove that we're Americans. And by the mid 20th century, we really are patriotic Americans, which I hope we still are today, but now with this international flavor as the church grows outside the United States. So a lot of that descends from these hearings, this these decisions that are made to get Reed Smoot into the Senate kind of kicks the church's assimilation into American culture into high gear.
And the point we're just trying to make here is the downstream effects of the Reed Smoot hearings are huge for the church.
Yeah.
This isn't, it's not just a blip in the historical radar. It shifts the course of the church in some pretty significant ways. We've highlighted a few.
For its impact, it's one of the most underappreciated events in the history of the church, because it just seems like it impacts everything after.
I've even heard Joseph F. Smith referred to as the second founder of Mormonism. I don't know how defensible that is, but I think you would have to point to this era to talk about it. We talked about it in our Women in Priesthood series with Lisa. We talked about how there's this whole priesthood reformation that happens during this time as well. I mean, there's so many things we can talk about what happens during this time, and it's all downstream from the Reed Smoot hearings, which again just seem to impact President Smith significantly.
Yeah. I guess you can just say Joseph Smith was the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, and you're covered in both ways. They're both named Joseph Smith, but yeah, when you're tracing any idea through the history of the church, you eventually bump into the transitional era and Joseph F. Smith, and he is without a doubt the towering figure of that era that causes a lot of things to happen. I mean, he's not the only guy, but there's a lot of things that happened during that era. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit here and talk about what happened to Reed Smoot. So he wins his seat in the Senate. Hooray. But that's really only the beginning. Ooh. He actually serves in the Senate for 5 additional terms. He's in the Senate until 1933, over 3 decades.
Yeah, 30-year run. That's impressive.
Not bad.
Along the way, he's going to work with presidents of the United States pretty closely, like William Howard Taft, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and many of the nation's most influential political leaders.
Yeah. And here's another fascinating finding that comes from Jan Shipp's excellent non-Latter-day Saint historian. She studied newspaper coverage of Reed Smoot and found that during his first Senate term, 94% of the articles about him identified him primarily as a Mormon. So the first thing people thought of when they thought of Senator Smoot was, oh, he's a Latter-day Saint. He's part of that Mormon church out there.
Yeah, and that's remarkable because that means almost every story is treating him as a representative of the church, right? Over time, she mentions that percentage steadily declines. He eventually just becomes known as an influential United States senator, but he was a good representative of our church in government.
Yeah, so in other words, as Americans become more familiar with Reed Smoot, they also become more familiar with Latter-day Saints.
And let's just kind of step back and think for a second of Reed Smoot, who is a U.S. senator and an apostle. So how would that work? Like, how did he do both? And the truth is that even while serving in Washington, Smoot remained deeply involved in his office as apostle and serving in the church. His home became the center of Latter-day Saint community in Washington, D.C. Sacrament meetings were held there every other week with folding chairs filling the house. You can kind of picture that. Kind of fun.
Yeah. And whatever his congressional responsibilities were, Smoot also continues to participate in meetings with the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, Temple Prayer Circles, other church responsibilities. And again, he probably not as much as the other apostles, but I think the other apostles recognized the importance of what he was doing in Washington as well.
Yeah, and when his Senate duties caused him to miss General Conference, like in 1918, President Joseph F. Smith reassured him by writing this in a letter, quote, "While you were missed, we all felt that the work you're engaged in was in the line of your duty and in harmony with this great work in which we are engaged." So, they saw what he was doing there as an extension of his work as an ambassador for Jesus Christ.
So, I mean, at times his role as senator and apostle overlapped in large degree. So on one occasion, for instance, President Warren G. Harding, he calls Senator Smoot late at night because the First Lady, Florence Harding, was really ill. And President Harding recalled the rite of a priesthood blessing. Reed Smoot apparently told him about priesthood blessings. And so President Harding invited Reed Smoot to come to the White House to give a blessing to his sick wife. So he immediately, Reed Smoot, grabs his consecrated oil and shows up at the executive mansion at the White House and gives a blessing to her. And this is just like one example of dozens of opportunities given to Reed Smoot because of his closeness to the leaders of the nation. He works with most of the prominent politicians from that time.
And what was President Harding's government role?
President
of the United States?
Of the United States, yeah, Warren G. Harding. He's not our greatest president, but
yeah.
You know,
I just wanted to emphasize that, like, so the president of the United States asked this apostle to come and give his wife a blessing.
Yeah,
I just want you to think about like how almost unimaginable that would have been only a few years earlier. Like the same senator whose religion had been lambasted and investigated so publicly and openly by Congress, he was now being invited to the White House to minister to the First Lady. How cool is that?
We should also note that Reed Smoot never really becomes known, never really gains a reputation for being like a fiery orator, like an amazing public speaker. He wasn't known for dramatic speeches or political theatrics. But that is important too. For instance, one historian summarized him this way. He said, there was little political glamour surrounding Reed Smoot. He was no orator. He shunned peccadillos of his fellows. He staged no rebellions. He coined no phrases. He offered no intriguing new ideas. He merely worked without stint or respite and continued to win elections. And sometimes that's exactly what makes someone influential. He's kind of boring, but he keeps showing up. He keeps doing the work, and he keeps earning trust. And that, over a long period of time, has a massive effect on how people perceive Latter-day Saints.
Love that. Yeah, so let's talk about that, his lasting legacy then. So we know that Reed Smoot is going to pave the way for many other Utahns to enter national public service. Campaign materials, for instance, later boasted, quote, "Not only has Senator Smoot become a household figure throughout the nation, but he has become successful in placing many Utahns in positions of national prominence where they too have brought honor and credit to the state of Utah." That's cool.
Yeah, and more importantly, his successful fight to retain his seat opens doors for future generations of Latter-day Saints in national politics. So other senators included William H. King, Albert Thomas, Frank Moss, Jake Garn, Orrin Hatch, Harry Reid, Mitt Romney, Mike Lee, John Curtis, and many others. That is a legacy that is important.
Yeah, so that legacy continues today, and it's coming from that long shadow of Reed Smoot. Mm-hmm. And, the Washington Post has noted that although Latter-day Saints make up only a small percentage of the American population, they have consistently been represented in Congress at what they call disproportionately high levels because of our faith's strong emphasis on public service, which I think is a cool tribute as well.
Yeah, so contrast the headlines when Reed Smoot retires in 1933. He's finally defeated in 1933 because of the Depression, a whole bunch of other things. Albert Thomas, who we're going to talk about, is elected in his place. But the Deseret News writes, he added more luster to the name of Utah than any man since the days of its founder. I assume that's speaking of Brigham Young, but contrast that with the Salt Lake Tribune 30 years earlier saying he has done more damage to the church than any person in history. Now they're saying, no, he's done more good for Utah than any person except for the founder, except for Brigham Young.
Yeah, so remember that, dear listeners, that when the immediate circumstances seem fraught and it seems like this is only leading to harmful consequences or whatever, when you're trying to stand your ground for what's right and what's true, listen, keep the long game in mind. Remember Reed Smoot. Remember this guy who took the fire for 4 years almost, and was told that he was the worst thing that had ever happened to the Mormon Church. And now fast forward 30 years, and how did it say it? He has added more luster than any man since the days of its founder. So keep the long game in mind.
Yeah.
And one of my favorites, maybe the most meaningful tribute, comes from President Joseph F. Smith himself. Only months before President Smith's own death, he wrote to Reed Smoot the following. He said, quote, "I cannot understand how anyone, not even your bitterest opponents, can fail to see the handwriting of an overruling providence in the success and honor you have won and achieved at the seat of government. Surely the Lord has magnified his servant." Close quote.
Yeah. So let's try and sum up here. The Reed Smoot hearings begin with a simple constitutional question: could an apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faithfully serve in the United States Senate?
And by the time the hearings ended, that question had grown into something much more unwieldy, right? The nation had now debated plural marriage, religious liberty, church and state, temple worship, and the place of a once isolated religious minority within American public life. This was more than just about Smoot, right?
Yeah, it's about the church, right? And the hearings are painful. They expose the private religious practices of the church to intense public scrutiny. They forced church leaders to confront lingering questions about plural marriage and other things, and they generated years of negative headlines.
But in the long run, these hearings became a turning point, and we tried to make a big deal about that, right? They accelerated the church's transition away from plural marriage, helped integrate Latter-day Saints into mainstream American society, demonstrating that faithful church members could serve successfully at the highest levels of the federal government. And it also precipitated a whole domino effect of policy and doctrinal reformation within our church.
Yeah. And Reed Smoot, to his credit, doesn't just survive the hearings. He spends the next 3 decades helping reshape how the rest of the United States viewed both Utah, but maybe even more importantly, how they viewed Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, so every Latter-day Saint who has served in Congress since then has in one way or another walked through a door that Senator Apostle Reed Smoot helped to open.
Yeah, that is correct.
What a legacy, Casey.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, I think that about sums up. We're going to continue this thread on the church and politics in the next episode. But yeah, Reed Smoot opens the door. That's probably the best thought to leave you with. So thanks for listening. Scott, this has been really fun and enjoyable. We hope you'll join us next time as we continue to explore Latter-day Saint history.